because they relate to very broad subjects, and so something should be reserved for the discussion. So thank you again. And the next lecturer is Альфредо Гонсалес-Руибаль, an archaeologist of the contemporary era. Please.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for organizing the conference in the first place and for inviting me to talk here today. And I'm going to talk about the archaeology of the contemporary past, the archaeology of the recent past, the archaeology of the present, as it is also known. The archaeology of the contemporary past is a recent but by now quite established field in different parts of the world. It's basically understood as the archaeology of the 20th and the 21st century. And it doesn't have a very long history because it's the contemporary era, so the contemporary era doesn't have a very long history either. The origins of this subfield of archaeology can be traced back to the 1970s, to the work of people like William Rudge, the late William Rudge. He was one of the main proponents of this kind of contemporary archaeology in the 1970s and the 1980s. And what he was studying during this period was the archaeology of garbage, of fresh garbage most of the time. He also dug landfills, but it was mostly fresh garbage from garbage cans that he was studying. And it might sound a little bit ludicrous, but the fact is that he actually found a lot of really interesting things in that rubbish that change our ideas of what the American people were consuming, about their consuming behavior, and he found out that many things that had been assumed through sociological or anthropological studies were actually wrong. So he looked at the material, he looked at what people were actually consuming, and he changed, as I said, our ideas of what consumption was in the United States, and he made great contributions also to to things like recycling, because there were lots of wrong ideas of how things decay, paper, plastic, and so on. The thing is that in the 1970s and 1980s, and even in the 1990s, contemporary archaeology was a very small field. It was basically William Rudge and a few other people like Michael Schiffer. It was mostly an American thing. It was mostly archaeologists based in the US. So in the 1990s, during the late 1990s, we have other projects that start to develop independently. We have, in the case of the US, for example, the Randall McGuire's project on the Ludlow massacre of 1913-1914, the Colorado Coalfield War. That was studied in 1997, and around that same time we have the development of First World War archaeology in France and the Netherlands. The motives for the development of these two kinds of archaeology is completely different. In the case of France and Belgium, it was rescue archaeology, contract archaeology. In the case of the US, it was more activist archaeology, and also archaeology that was based on scientific goals, so to say, to produce knowledge. During the last 20 years, the expansion of the field has been enormous, and we have people doing contemporary archaeology in very different places of the world, not just in the United States or Northern Europe, as was the case 25 years ago or 30 years ago, but we have projects in South America, in Spain, in France, Central Europe, and even in Asia and the Middle East. So I would like to outline two different ways of doing contemporary archaeology, which are similar but also quite different in the same way at the same time. And we could speak of contemporary archaeology that is more focused on the present and contemporary society's strict sense of. And then we could speak about an archaeology of the contemporary past or the contemporary era that is more historical in character. So it's more similar to historical archaeology. And I think that both have pros and cons, and I will try to explain here which are these characteristics and which are the assets and the problems that these archaeologists face. So the second wave, so to say, of contemporary archaeology that started around 2000 was quite different from the archaeology that William Bradley was doing in the 1970s, because this new contemporary archaeology was more creative, more theoretical, more experimental. It was more related to the arts, more related to ethnography, to cultural studies, material culture studies, and so on. And people that have been following this line for the last 20 years, they have done amazing work on really strange topics from the point of view of conventional archaeology, like the archaeology of homeless people, autoarchaeology, archaeologists studying themselves or their families, their homes. Also things like popular music, rock festivals. Also the aesthetics play a very important role in this kind of archaeology. The relationship between the visual arts and archaeology, the potential of archaeological research, archaeological methods to produce work that is interesting from an aesthetic point of view. These archaeologists, they consider that the archaeology of the contemporary past cannot be simply the archaeology of a specific period, like the archaeology of the Iron Age or the archaeology of the Bronze Age, because this would mean that we are squandering the potential of contemporary archaeology to make a contribution to the field at large, a contribution to the theory, to the method of archaeology. So they suggest that we break with the chronological framework of archaeology, and we do things that are maybe a little bit crazy, or sound a little bit crazy, but force us to confront the discipline in a completely different way. And so this is a bit different from the other approach, and this is a simplification because, of course, reality is always more complex, and there are people working throughout both fields or both approaches. But the more historically oriented contemporary archaeology is more related, as I was saying at the beginning, to historical archaeology. In a sense, it's not so different from Roman archaeology or medieval archaeology, what these people are doing, these type of contemporary archaeologists are doing. They are studying basically the 20th century as a specific period with specific problems that have to be solved and that can be solved or approached from an archaeological point of view. So they are asking questions to the archaeological record that are not so different from the questions that archaeologists have been asking themselves for a very long time, and that we saw in the video of the colleagues, of our Russian colleagues. I mean, it's the same questions about how people lived in the past, how they experienced life and death. And this kind of archaeology has been often conducted as part of rescue archaeology. So it was mostly contract archaeologists who had to deal with these materials, with the recent materials, and they had to make sense of these things. And especially this happened with the things that were more removed in time. So one of the first periods, or one of the first historical events that was approached by archaeologists and by contract archaeologists was the First World War. As I said, in France and in Belgium, it was development-led archaeology that first started to take these things seriously, to document them systematically, and in some cases to transform them in heritage assets, in places that could be visited by the public, and museum exhibitions, open sites, and so on. And of course, this is, in the case of the First World War, it's not just archaeology, because these are people, I mean, the people that are being excavated, sometimes the remains of these people are people that have living relatives, so it's an archaeology that's it's very emotional. So in a way, it's very much like historical archaeology, but at the same time, it's not like doing Roman archaeology. It's an archaeology that still matters too much to many people, and this makes it very interesting, but at the same time, it makes it quite complicated. Another way of approaching the recent past with this, let's say, more chronological framework, a more historical framework, is the archaeology of the Anthropocene that has been developing in the last 5 or 6 years. It's a very young thing, like the study of the Anthropocene itself. As you know, the Anthropocene is this new geological era that is being proposed by natural scientists, and depending on who you listen to, it might begin in the late 18th century or the mid 20th century. So most geologists now consider that from a stratigraphic point of view, it is the mid 20th century that actually marks very clearly the beginning of a new geological era that is strongly shaped by human beings, by the action of human beings. And archaeologists here have a lot to contribute, because we study human beings and we study materiality, material things, landscapes, objects, and so on. So it is obvious that we have to contribute to this definition of a new geological era. And there are people like Matt Edgeworth, a British archaeologist who is doing a lot of work along these lines in collaboration with biologists and geologists, and he has actively contributed to the definition of this beginning of the Anthropocene in the mid-20th century by providing archaeological data, archaeological stratigraphies, or what he calls the archaeosphere, which would be a specific layer of a geological layer that is produced by human beings. In my own approach, I try to take things from both sides, from the more historically oriented archaeology and the more creative and theoretical archaeology of the present or the recent past. So I believe that we have to do a historically oriented contemporary archaeology, a historically oriented archaeology of the 20th and the 21st century. But I also think that this does not mean that we have to waste the potential of this kind of archaeology to make important contributions to archaeology as a whole. So I don't think we have to make archaeology, the archaeology of the contemporary past, as just another chronological archaeology or period type of archaeology. So I would say that we have to do an archaeology of the contemporary era, the 20th and the 21st century, but with 3 caveats. The first one is that I think that we have to define the contemporary era, our age, the period in which we are living, purely on archaeological terms. So rather than just doing an archaeology of what historians say it is contemporary archaeology, or geologists say it is the Anthropocene, I think we have to try to define the contemporary era on material terms, using things like material culture, technology, and the archaeological record. At the same time, I think that we have the opportunity, when we are working with remains of the 20th and the 21st century, we have the opportunity to do things that are not allowed in earlier periods. We can do things that are creative, that are a little bit crazy. We can be more destructive with recent remains, of course. Often they are not protected, and we can experiment and see what happens, and some things might be interesting, some other things may not, but at least we have to experiment and see what happens. So this is an example of an experimental dig by Oscar Aldred and Gisli Palsson. They, instead of doing an excavation, well, they did an excavation, but they also did an incavation. They reburied the artifacts not just the artifacts that they excavated, but the artifacts that they employed in the excavation, the tools, the archaeological tools themselves. And the third thing is that it is important when we do contemporary archaeology to keep in mind deep history, the long term, as Sven was saying before. So I think we have to keep this perspective, because this is actually what archaeology does best, to look at the long term. This is something that contemporary historians cannot do, or anthropologists. So it would be a pity that we, who have been trained as archaeologists, in my case I was trained as a prehistoric archaeologist, that we squander this potential to do something unique that nobody else can do, and see again what happens. It's again about experimentation. What happens if we connect Paleolithic in the present? And of course it's not so much that we connect it, but these are things that are connected already. The images that you can see here are from an excavation that I did in Spain a few years ago. It was a concentration camp that was established by Francisco Franco, the former dictator of Spain, in 1940, and I excavated, among other things, I excavated the latrines of the concentration camp, and I found a lot of stuff that was related to the inmates that were in this camp at that time. But during the excavation and the survey, we also found Iron Age pottery, Roman coins, and even an early medieval cemetery from the 6th century. And these are things that are related in a way. When we found that, we understood better what the concentration camp meant, because the concentration camp was a huge interruption in this landscape. This had been an ordinary landscape that had been occupied by people, by peasants, that had tilled the soil, that have lived there, that have buried their dead there, and suddenly concentration camp was established, and the place remained silent, as it's still silent today. And now this is the tricky part of my talk, because I would like to suggest some ideas for doing an archaeology of contemporary Russia. And this is my second time only in Russia, and I have spent a total of 3 days in Russia in all my life. But my suggestions done out of admiration for Russian history, and with, of course, a lot of modesty, and it's more like a dialogue, because I mean, I read quite a lot, but there are many things that I don't know, so I would like to, of course, to know about, to get your reactions. So the other thing that I'm going to talk about Russia, about that we are in Russia, is that I think that Russia is a wonderful place to do contemporary archaeology, and in many ways it reminds me of Spain. We have a similar history during the 20th century, because both countries have experienced civil war, total war, dictatorship, the collapse of traditional communities, and so on. So when I read about Russian history, sometimes I feel like I'm reading about Spanish history, but only in a completely different scale. Of course, everything here is much more colossal and excessive, which makes it even more interesting. The first reason why I think Russia is a great place to do contemporary archaeology is strictly archaeological. Gavin Lucas, when he was talking about the archaeological record, he says that the things that we see best archaeologically are those changes that are highly irreversible. That is, it's very difficult to see daily life, because when we do something all the time, every day, every time we do it, we erase the traces of the previous action, right? So it is only when things collapse that we can see them really well archaeologically, right? And a very good example is the case of the Titanic. We can know a lot archaeologically about the Titanic because it sunk in 1912. If it would not have sunk in 1912, it would have traveled many times for many years, perhaps many decades, and then it would have been scrapped, and we wouldn't know anything about all these travels except what has been written about them, of course, or what would have been written about them, and that's it. But we probably wouldn't even have traces about the ship itself. So we need catastrophes to do. I mean, it's not strictly necessary, but as we know, catastrophes are great for doing archaeology in general. So systemic collapse is great for archaeologists, and Russia has experienced systemic collapse at least a couple of times during the 20th century. First, the collapse of the Tsarist regime, which was more than just the collapse of a political system, it was the collapse of a certain type of society, of pre-industrial ancien regime society. And then, of course, we have the collapse of the Soviet regime during the late 20th century. And in both cases, both phenomena of collapse have left a plethora of ruins that are ideal to be examined from an archaeological point of view. In the case of the Soviet regime, of course, it was we have lots of infrastructures of buildings that were very specific of the communist economy, or the political system of the Soviet regime, and they are archaeological record now, and they can be studied using archaeological methodologies. In the case of the Tsarist regime, it is not so much the buildings associated to Tsarist power, of course, because they were reused during the Soviet period, but it was mostly the landscape, the rural landscape, the villages, a peasant lifestyle that was transformed through the modernization policies of the Soviet regime from 1917 onwards. So again, these are ruins that can be archaeological sites that can be studied archaeologically. But there are other reasons, of course. First, we have this wonderful archaeological record that can be studied. And this is a kind of archaeological record that I have studied in Spain myself, the collapse of peasant societies, the ruins of the Franco regime. But there are other reasons archaeology can make a contribution to this. First, we have the idea of atmosphere that has been developed by some archaeologists recently. So the idea of atmosphere is basically that there are things in the built environment that cannot be easily translated into style. So we know that there are different styles, right? A building can be neoclassic or Baroque or Romanesque or whatever, or Byzantine. But there are things that cannot be reduced to that. There is an atmosphere to Russian communism, as there is an atmosphere to Francoist Spain, or there is an atmosphere to Maoist China. And this atmosphere has to do with material texture, with colors, with patina. And this is something that is not easily translated into words. So this is why archaeology can make an interesting contribution here to see how these atmospheres, these material atmospheres, make different countries, different political regimes, different cultures different. So there are also the infrastructures of totalitarianism. Dictatorships all over the world work in a very obvious way, concealing their acts, and this usually has to do with strategies of extermination or of political violence. And the archaeology of concentration camps and detention centers is a huge issue in contemporary archaeology now. There are people studying this in Canada, the United States, Spain, Austria, South America, and of course, Russia offers a very good opportunity with the Gulag. I understand that this kind of archaeology might not be the most popular at the moment in the country, but there are some people that are actually doing it. I know of some archaeologists of Eastern Europe that are documenting some of the remains of the Gulag archaeologically. As I was saying before, the collapse of the Tsarist regime was, among other things, the collapse of traditional societies, of peasant societies, that was relatively sudden compared to other parts of Europe, like Northern Europe, which was a smoother transition from the pre-modern to the modern period. And then contemporary warfare, both the Civil War and of course the Second World War, were extremely destructive in Russia. They took not just millions of lives, but they also produce drastic changes in the landscape, and they involve the mobilization of enormous material means. So I think that if you want to understand what the 20th century was like, you have to understand total war. And if you want to understand total war, of course, you have to come to Russia, the territories of the former Soviet Union. So just to finish, to conclude, there are, of course, lots of potentialities, but also challenges to this kind of archaeology in Russia. There are not, at least that I'm aware of, not a lot of contemporary archaeologists working in Russia at the moment. I know of some works by colleagues in Norway in collaboration with Russian colleagues that are studying places like the area of Murmansk, Svalbard, where there was a Russian mining town until 1998 and so on, but there is not a lot of work. And this is quite surprising because one of the first books that was published about contemporary archaeology was Victor Buckley's An Archaeology of Socialism, which was about the Narkomfin building here in Moscow. So it was one of the books that inaugurated this second wave of contemporary archaeology in 2000. About the challenges, looting is the big problem, especially the looting of sites associated to the Second World War. And here we have to distinguish at least three groups from what I've read. We have history amateurs, so people that are just fascinated by history and they collect things. Sometimes they excavate, sometimes they use metal detectors, but not necessarily. And they collect as much as they can, but out of love for history. They are not necessarily highly destructive. The work of some of these people have been studied by Olga Sesneva in the town of Kaliningrad in former Königsberg. Then we have, of course, the white diggers, people that are trying to exhume the remains of the soldiers, the Soviet soldiers that fled during the Second World War, and they are doing an amazing job recovering these people, contacting the relatives so that they can be buried in a proper way, and then organizing official funerals where these people are reburied in a dignified way as they deserve. And they are very meticulous in the way they excavate and they record, but as far as I know, they are not proper archaeologists, and they do not understand their work as archaeology, and there is a lot of information that unfortunately gets lost during this process. And then we have the real problem, which are the black diggers. So they are destroying sites all over Russia, especially in areas like the Caucasus or around St. Petersburg. And they are not just destroying sites that are important from an archaeological point of view, but it's an ethical problem also, because they are disturbing graves of people that could have been identified, could have been exhumed, identified, and the remains returned to their families. So these are huge problems, and a heritage legislation that protects these recent sites would probably help. In the case of Poland, for example, they have the same problems, and now they are trying to tackle that, although metal detectors that are still destroying a lot, but things are improving a little bit. So just to conclude, I think that Russia is an amazing place to do contemporary archaeology. It has an extraordinary archaeological record for the 20th century. And it is not just interesting because doing archaeology in Russia will allow us to understand better the 20th century history of Russia, but I think it will allow us to understand the world in general. So we need to do archaeology of contemporary Russia to understand the contemporary world, things like war, dictatorship, but also the Anthropocene, how human beings are drastically shaping the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm sure there are many questions.
Thank you very much for a really wonderful report, and this contemporary archaeology is very interesting, but what is the difference, for your opinion, between archaeology and ethnography? Maybe archaeology and history. For me, it's better talk about archaeological methods in during historical research or ethnographical research, because it's a big difference between archaeology, like a science, yes, and archaeological methods.
Yeah, actually there are some people that talk about archaeological ethnography or ethnographic archaeology to refer to this kind of work that is in between both fields. Yeah, and in my case, I prefer to talk about archaeology because I always try that things go first. So, and when I dig sites from the Spanish Civil War, the Franco period in Spain, I try not to read what historians say. I prefer to excavate first and try to get my own conclusions, and then I read the historians or the anthropologists' work so as not to be influenced. So I want the objects to be as celebrant as possible and to think as an archaeologist. Although of course you have to collaborate always with ethnographers and historians, and it's always a very hybrid field. Yeah. But I think we have, as archaeologists, we should give precedence to things.
Yeah.
If a contemporary excavated material, what do you think should be happened to the objects? Should they go into a museum, like if you excavate a Roman emperor, it ends up in a museum, in an exhibition, but then it is dead. It's out of the contemporary use. For these contemporary sites, of course, if you have human remains and you want to bury them, that is transfers the archaeological object in a completely different sphere. That means in the sphere of families, the sphere of burials, and these houses, which are very interesting to study. But what shall we do with the objects? Shall we preserve them in a glass box like a museum, or shall we study them and then give them to the decay maybe, or to the people who bury them, or to some other use? So,
yeah, that's a very good question and a difficult one, and I think it depends a lot on the context. So it's not like when you are doing Roman archaeology, it's easy, right? You pick up everything and you store it in a museum, and then you can show it or not. Although these things are becoming less easy these days because museums are full of stuff and they don't know what to do with it. But anyway, the idea is more or less clear. In the case of contemporary times, it depends a lot on the context. For example, we have a problem now in Spain with exhumations of people that were killed during the dictatorship because they have lots of things with them, and we return the artifacts to the families with the bodies. But at the same time, these are amazing historical artifacts that tell a lot about an era and about specific events that are of relevance for the entire world, I mean for the entire country. So we now fear that we are losing a lot of a very valuable resource, not just in scientific terms, but also in heritage terms. So in my opinion, we have to return that to the families, of course, but then perhaps we can convince some of the relatives to donate some of the artifacts so that we can have a museum to show them. And then there are things, I mean, when we excavate things that are really recent, in some cases we just rebury them, we recycle them. We did that in some of our excavations. We recycle a lot of glass and metal and so on. And we can also play with these things. We can give them to the public so that they can experience them, they can touch them, and this is something that you can also not always do for other periods. So I think we have to be flexible, and depending on the situation, we do one thing or the other.
I would have a very general question, maybe related to the question how archaeology is developed, or the archaeologies are developing in the future. I mean, if you look at the research history, I would say there are sometimes tendencies when archaeologists or the different archaeological disciplines are united, and there are other tendencies when there is an atomization is going on. There's Paleolithic archaeology, there's Neolithic archaeology, there's Roman archaeology, medieval, and archaeology of a contemporary period. So my question would be a little bit, okay, from the background of the archaeological methodology, I think there are quite a lot of similarities. But is there any difference in the theoretical background of contemporary archaeology? What is quite different, for example, to anthropology or ethnoarchaeology or prehistoric archaeology? Or is it, so it's a question, how do you see the development? Is there the necessity somehow to make a difference between the archaeologies about different historical periods? Or is it a question of a general human anthropology which should be introduced into our different sub-disciplines, which unites us much more than that was the case perhaps 10 years ago?
Well, I believe in a single discipline in archaeology from the early Paleolithic to our days, with the similar theoretical principles and methodologies. But then when we are talking about the societies that we study, they are, of course, very different, and this means that the theoretical agendas are also, or can be also different in some ways. And for me, the big divide is modernity. I think that modern societies, especially late modern societies or hyper-modern societies, the 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, they are so different from small-scale societies like societies of the Neolithic or early hunter-gatherers, that the sociological framework that we have to use is also different. But at the same time, I think that we can keep asking the same questions that have to do, for example, like the questions that Sven was asking about migrations, technology. These are things, diseases, these are things that are pertinent for prehistory and are pertinent for the contemporary world as well. So I think it is perhaps more interesting to look at these things that are interesting in the long term, irrespective of the period, rather than, or not just to the things that specifically define the contemporary era.
So how do you define the border between the archaeology, historical archaeology and archaeology of contemporary era? Because excavating of the first war trenches and the documenting the standing ruins is not the same field. Where is the border?
Well, I think that contemporary archaeology is basically an extension of historical archaeology. We are dealing with the archaeology of a historical period. Probably one of the main differences is that when you do contemporary archaeology, you inevitably deal with living people. And this completely changes the way you do archaeology. The public engagement, the way people relate to the remains, it's not the same. Even when you are dealing with 19th century remains, it's not the same as when you are dealing with Second World War remains. People have strong feelings and strong ideas about these very recent past. So I would say that it's basically an issue of society, of contemporary society.
I would like to know, what is the contribution of archaeology to the discussion about the Anthropocene? Is it to identify the layers around 1940, 1950, war pollution, plastic, and so on? Or is it a discussion, when does it start, this Anthropocene, maybe in the Neolithic or in the Metal Ages, when pollution is visible even in the ice cores? What is the specific methodological contribution of archaeology to that? It's a big discussion of that.
Yeah, there are different levels. There is a more philosophical level, if you will, where archaeologists are contributing to the debate about what is the Anthropocene, what does it mean that human beings have an action in the environment and shape it deeply. So some people say that we can go back to Homo erectus, for instance, when the hominids start to manage fire, right? So there is this kind of philosophical reflection, and then there is a more practical thing, as you were saying, to identify in which moment in the archaeological records we see plastic, aluminium, synthetic alloys, and all that. So, and I think in both ways archaeology can make an interesting contribution.
A very interesting paper, thank you. I wanted to ask, at what point does your contemporary archaeology come into connection with potential legal forensic archaeology? So the case studies you've been looking at are mostly 50, 60, 70 years old and probably won't have a criminal prosecution involved. But of course there are similar investigations in the Balkans, in Iraq, on mass graves. And there are also potentially, when you're looking at modern archaeology of buildings, there may even be evidence for negligence by architects, which may have legal repercussions. So I suppose I wanted to ask you, do you think there's a division between the kind of legally forensically relevant case studies and sites, and also whether there's then a methodological difference, because again the question of what happens to the evidence and how is it collected becomes even more difficult than simply when we're living relatives.
This is one of the problems with contemporary archaeology, that there is amazing work that has been done in the Balkans or in Iraq with mass graves that cannot be published, simply because this is going to be used as evidence in court. So some of my colleague archaeologists, they are publishing things that are in the fringes of the core of the forensic project, but there are things that will have to wait like 20 or 30 years before they can be disclosed. So this is a problem, and it doesn't have to be to do necessarily with time, because if you dig a mass grave with victims of the Nazis, then this has to be carried in a forensic way, because this is a crime that can still be prosecuted. But the same thing in Spain, it doesn't matter, because the justice in Spain has decided that they are not prosecuting this crime, so it doesn't matter if it's from the 1950s, for example. You can excavate them as archaeologists, as an archaeologist, and that's it. So yeah, it's a difficult thing. Yeah.
Yeah. My question has a bit to do with your former question with Sanada. Since the engagement of the public in archaeology is so important, and archaeology is all about also engaging the public and creating links with different sorts of communities, could you quickly say something about in what extent do you find different relation of the public, the present public, to contemporary archaeology that is perhaps different to other kinds of archaeology?
I think that in the case of when you do contemporary archaeology, people, normal people outside academia, they understand it immediately. They like it immediately. So that's my experience working in very different contexts. And this is something that has been studied in the UK also, where it is well known that recent heritage is very much valued, especially among the younger generations. And it's because people immediately see a relation between these things that you are doing and their own memories and what they know and so on. And for me this is something that is useful to go beyond the contemporary. For me that's an opportunity to explore archaeology, to explore history, to tell them about other periods. So this is why I insist a lot on this deep perspective. When I show people aside from the 1930s or the 1940s, I try to make connections with the deeper past. And it's usually very easy because you always find other stuff.
I think it's difficult past is not closed, and especially the mass graves of the Franco repression shows that this has a lot of consequences also for the property rights and so on. This killed people, their relatives nowadays. Yeah, other questions? Or should we stop here? Thank you very much again.